A bus carrying 10 passengers drove through a dense forest at 2 a.m., but when it finally reached its destination, only 9 passengers remained. Everyone looked at each other, confused and terrified. But then came the most chilling realization: the missing passenger had never boarded the bus in the first place. The village of Ravenwood had always carried an air of quiet suspicion, its cobbled streets whispering secrets with every footstep. But on this particular morning, an unseasonal chill hung in the air, not from the weather, but from the unspoken tension clinging to every doorstep. The town square, usually buzzing with the hum of idle gossip, was unnervingly silent. Shopkeepers arranged their displays with distracted hands, and even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Something had disturbed the delicate balance of this seemingly peaceful place. At the heart of it all stood Blackthorn Manor, an estate draped in ivy and misfortune. Its wrought iron gates, rusted with time, groaned in protest as Inspector Jonathan Graves pushed them open. A single raven, perched atop the stone pillar, let out a shrill cry before vanishing into the thick morning fog. A bad omen, the villagers would say. But Graves wasn't a man who believed in omens, only in evidence. He stepped into the grand foyer, where the air was thick with the scent of aged wood, and something else. Something faintly floral, yet oddly out of place. The servants, dressed in crisp black uniforms, stood rigidly along the hallway, their eyes darting between one another as if each feared they might be the next to fall under suspicion. A body had been found in the grand study. Judge Alistair Harrow, a man known for his unwavering sense of justice, was slumped over his desk, his face eerily still, his once intimidating presence reduced to an eerie silence. Papers lay scattered before him, a half-written note frozen in time beneath his unmoving hand. Beside him, an overturned glass of brandy had left a dark stain on the mahogany surface. But it wasn't the sight of death that unsettled Inspector Graves, it was the faint trace of lilac lingering in the air, a scent that had no place in a room of mahogany and dust. Who found the body? Graves' voice cut through the stillness like a blade. The butler, Mr. Halstead, stepped forward, his usually impassive face betraying the slightest hint of unease. It was the maid, sir, Miss Eleanor Pierce. She came to deliver his morning tea, and found him like this. Graves turned to the young maid standing near the doorway, her hands trembling as she clutched her apron. Miss Pierce, did you notice anything unusual before you entered? She hesitated. The door, it was slightly open. It's always shut in the mornings. I thought maybe he'd already been up. Graves nodded. It was a small detail, but small details often unraveled the greatest mysteries. And the tea, did he drink it? She shook her head. No, sir, the cup was untouched, still warm when I set it down. So it wasn't the tea, but the brandy. That was another story. He bent down, examining the spilled liquid. The scent was strong, but beneath the sharp burn of alcohol, there was something else. A subtle bitter undertone. He pulled out a handkerchief and dabbed it against the damp surface, bringing it close to his nose. Almonds. His stomach tightened. It was a scent he knew all too well. Cyanide. A quick death. A certain death. And not something one simply accidentally ingested. As Graves straightened, his sharp eyes scanned the room. The broken quill on the desk, the faint smear of ink on the judge's fingertips, the way the papers had been disturbed, as if someone had been searching for something important. He turned back to the butler. Where is the judge's will? Halstead hesitated, exchanging a brief glance with the housekeeper. It should be in his study's locked drawer, sir. But, the key is missing. Of course it is. Graves exhaled slowly. This was no ordinary death. This was calculated, cold, precise. Behind him, in the dim light of the hallway, the villagers had begun to gather, their hushed whispers bleeding into one another, their eyes gleaming with morbid curiosity. They were waiting for answers. And Graves intended to find them. But one thing was certain. Someone in this house was a killer, and they were still here. The grand courtroom of Ravenshire County had seen its fair share of trials, but never one as charged as this. The air was thick with tension, the weight of 1,000 whispers pressing against the high arched ceilings. Every wooden bench was filled, the villagers sitting in rapt attention, their breaths held in anticipation. Edmund Blackwell, the accused, sat in the defendant's box, his face carved from stone, his hands folded neatly before him, as if he were merely a spectator and not a man on trial for murder. At the witness stand, Charles Langley, the prosecution's star witness, wiped his brow with a trembling hand. He had barely begun his testimony when his face twisted in pain. A strangled gasp escaped his lips, his fingers clawing at his throat. Then, without another word, he slumped forward. The courtroom erupted in chaos. "Poison!" someone cried. A collective gasp rippled through the chamber. Langley lay motionless, his lips tinged with an unnatural blue, his final words stolen before they could condemn or exonerate. Miss Eleanor Marlowe, seated at the far end of the gallery, remained eerily still, where others had risen to their feet in alarm. She merely observed, her sharp eyes scanning the faces around her, watching reactions, measuring fear, suspicion, guilt. She had seen this before, the faintest scent of bitter almonds, imperceptible to the untrained nose, but unmistakable to her. Cyanide, a clean, swift execution. This was no accident. This was calculated. A cold silence settled as the judge banged his gavel. Court is adjourned. Everyone will leave in an orderly fashion. The jury was ushered out, the murmurs of speculation following them like ghosts. Witnesses exchanged uneasy glances, some lingering near the door, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Too many guilty faces in this room, Miss Marlowe noted, and there, still seated with an unnatural stillness, was Edmund Blackwell. He had not moved an inch, had not gasped in shock or feigned horror. His gaze flickered once, to Langley's body, then to the judge, and then almost imperceptibly, to the empty seat where his wife should have been sitting. Miss Marlowe narrowed her eyes, too calm, too composed, too expectant. As the crowd spilled onto the streets, whispers moved faster than wildfire. Ravenshire had always been a town where secrets nestled in the cracks of cobblestone roads, hidden behind polite smiles and drawn curtains. But today, those secrets were shifting, unraveling, making their way into hushed conversations and wide-eyed speculations. Miss Marlowe stepped onto the street, the crisp autumn air biting at her cheeks. The town square buzzed with nervous energy. She passed the Hollow Oak Inn, where the tavern keeper was already deep in conversation with a group of townsfolk, recounting the courtroom spectacle with growing embellishment. She caught snippets. Right there in front of the whole town. He didn't even flinch. And his wife, have you seen her lately? Keeping to herself far too much, if you ask me. Mrs. Blackwell, the name lingered in Miss Marlowe's thoughts as she made her way through the square. The wife of a man accused of murder, a woman who had once been the most charming hostess in all of Ravenshire, now barely seen in public. Something about this case was too convenient. Too neat. She stopped at the entrance of Ashworth Tea Room, where a small gathering of familiar faces had already settled into quiet gossip. Mrs. Whitmore, always keen to be at the center of fresh scandal, leaned in close to Colonel Ashford, a retired military man who prided himself on knowing everyone's business. Across from them sat Margaret Hawthorne, a woman whose polite exterior masked an insatiable hunger for information. Miss Marlowe settled herself at a nearby table, ordering a pot of Earl Grey as she listened. She never interrupted. She never questioned, but she always listened. Langley was going to say something, Mrs. Whitmore muttered, her voice hushed with intrigue. He barely opened his mouth before she made a vague choking motion. Too much of a coincidence, Colonel Ashford agreed. Someone wanted to make sure he never spoke. And Edmund Blackwell, not a single reaction, Margaret added, as if he knew. Miss Marlowe stirred her tea absent-mindedly, her mind racing. Yes, it was all too easy. The obvious suspect rarely turned out to be the true culprit. And in a town where everyone watched and whispered, she had learned one thing: the ones who truly knew the answers were the ones who spoke the least. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the town of Ravenshire hummed with the echoes of a crime that had only just begun to unravel. Miss Marlowe finished her tea, placing her cup down with quiet certainty. She had work to do, and she would find the truth, no matter how deep it was buried. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind that wrapped around your throat and refused to let go. The moment Henry Caldwell took the stand, something felt off. He reached for the glass of water beside him, his fingers trembling just slightly, imperceptible to most, but not to Eleanor Finch. She had seen it before, a silent, creeping sign of something far more sinister. Caldwell parted his lips, ready to speak, when his breath hitched, his eyes widened, and then in a single heartbeat, he collapsed. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Some jurors bolted to their feet, while others remained frozen, too stunned to react. The prosecutor's papers slipped from his hands, scattering across the polished floor like fallen leaves. "Poison," someone whispered, and the word moved like a current, surging through the chamber, growing louder with every repetition. At the defendant's table sat Victor Holloway, his face carved from stone, his expression unreadable. His gaze flickered from Caldwell's lifeless body to the murmuring crowd, then to the judge. There was no panic, no protest of innocence, just a calculated stillness that, Eleanor noted, was more telling than any outburst. The judge called for order, his gavel slamming against the wood, but the courtroom had already unraveled into chaos. The bailiffs moved in, ushering people out, while murmurs of speculation clung to the air like smoke. Eleanor slipped through the dispersing crowd, her mind already piecing together the puzzle. By the time she stepped out onto the courthouse steps, the town was alive with whispers. The news had spread like fire through dry grass: a witness dead in open court, a man accused of a crime he might not have committed, and a case that had just taken a dark, unexpected turn. Eleanor knew better than to take things at face value. In a place like Hawthorne Hollow, where secrets festered beneath polished smiles, the truth was never what it seemed. The pieces of the game had shifted. Now she just had to figure out who had made the first move. Her next stop was inevitable: the Blackwood tea room. If there was one thing she knew, it was that gossip moved faster than the morning papers, and the town's social elite would already be dissecting every angle of the tragedy. As she stepped inside, the low hum of conversation stilled for the briefest moment before resuming with renewed fervor. She didn't have to wait long before Mrs. Pritchard, the ever-watchful matriarch of the town's upper crust, spoke in her clipped, knowing tone. "Strange, isn't it?" she mused, stirring her tea with deliberate slowness. Caldwell was about to reveal something, and now conveniently, he never will. A soft chuckle from the corner drew Eleanor's attention. Lillian Harrington, the ever-distant socialite, barely glanced up from her cup. "More interesting than Caldwell is Victor's wife," she murmured. "Cecilia Holloway. She's been acting different." The words lingered in the air like an unfinished melody. Eleanor leaned in slightly, her voice deceptively casual. "Different how?" Lillian's lips curled into a small secretive smile, distant, almost haunted. "And then there's the matter of the letter." "The letter?" Mrs. Pritchard set her cup down with a soft clink. "A foreign postmark, arrived at the Holloway estate just this morning. She didn't open it, just tucked it away. A letter, a witness dead, a man too calm in the face of his own trial." Eleanor had seen enough mysteries to know that there was no such thing as coincidence. As she stepped out of the tea room, the Holloway estate loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the fading light. The pieces were falling into place. The game had begun, and Eleanor Finch never lost. The Blackthorn estate loomed ahead, its towering presence casting long shadows across the gravel path as Eleanor Graves approached. The house, an aging monument of wealth and whispered secrets, stood in eerie silence, its stained glass windows catching the last remnants of daylight. She paused at the threshold, the air thick with the scent of aged wood, and something else, something faint but unmistakable. Decay. A place like this never truly let go of its past. The door groaned open, as though protesting against her presence. The butler, Mr. Alden, emerged from the dim corridor beyond, his sharp gaze sweeping over her before he stepped aside with mechanical precision. "Miss Graves," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "The mistress is expecting you." Eleanor nodded, stepping inside. The grand hallway swallowed her whole, its walls adorned with heavy tapestries and ancient portraits, whose painted eyes seemed to follow her movements. Every detail here was curated to maintain an illusion of order: ornate vases without a speck of dust, marble floors polished to a mirror sheen. But Eleanor had long since learned that a house too clean was a house hiding something. As she moved deeper inside, she noted the faint imprint of damp footprints on the rug leading toward the east wing, recent, hurried, a detail easily dismissed, but she never dismissed anything. Lady Rosalind Blackthorne sat by the fireplace in the drawing room, her back impossibly straight, her slender fingers wrapped around a delicate porcelain teacup. She was a vision of practiced composure, her widow's black draped elegantly around her like the morning was just another accessory to be worn. But it was her eyes, dark, watchful, that betrayed something deeper, something tightly coiled beneath the surface. "Miss Graves," she murmured, voice smooth as silk, "I must say, I didn't expect your visit so soon." Eleanor offered a small smile, the kind that was neither warm nor dismissive. "Tragedies have a way of accelerating schedules," she replied, letting her gaze drift just past Lady Rosalind to the sideboard where another teacup sat, untouched. The slightest ring of residue at the bottom. Lady Rosalind followed her line of sight, but said nothing, merely raising her own cup to her lips in a slow, deliberate motion. A test, perhaps, to see if Eleanor would react. She didn't, not yet. "I was told Lord Blackthorne was in excellent health," Eleanor continued, her tone light, conversational. "His passing must have been unexpected." A flicker of something too brief to name crossed Lady Rosalind's face. She lowered her cup. "One never knows when fate will intervene," she said smoothly, but there was a weight to her words, a rehearsed nature that made them feel carefully placed, not spoken. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, just enough to unsettle, her voice soft but cutting. "Fate, or something else." For the first time the mask cracked. A breath too shallow, a hand tightening just slightly around the porcelain. A moment later, it was gone, replaced by an elegant sigh. "I suppose you'll find out soon enough." Eleanor sat back, satisfied. The game had begun. Eleanor Ravenscroft moved through the Black Hollow Manor with quiet precision, her sharp eyes absorbing every detail as the weight of the estate's silence pressed against her. The house, grand and sprawling, was like a body holding its breath, waiting, watching. The drawing room was arranged meticulously, as if curated to mask the tension seeping from its walls. The polished mahogany sideboard gleamed under the chandelier's dim light, a pristine tea set resting atop it, every cup placed with deliberate care. Yet Eleanor wasn't deceived by the elegance. It was the small details, the almost imperceptible ones, that interested her. The way one of the cups sat slightly askew, its handle pointing just a degree off from the others, the faintest smear of powder on the silver teaspoon, wiped away but not entirely erased. A deception not meant for the untrained eye, but Eleanor had built her life on seeing what others missed. The room's heavy stillness broke with the creak of the door. Mr. Sutherland, the butler, entered, his demeanor composed but his posture just a shade too rigid. "Miss Ravenscroft," he greeted smoothly, "I trust you're finding everything to your liking." Her gaze didn't leave the tea set. "Quite," she murmured, her tone mild but edged with intent. "Though I must admit, Mr. Sutherland, I've always been fascinated by the little things, the unnoticed details that seem insignificant until, of course they aren't. The butler's expression remained neutral, but she didn't miss the tightening at his jawline. I'm afraid I wouldn't know much about that, he replied evenly. A house this size, things are bound to be misplaced. Misplaced. A careful choice of words. Eleanor let the silence stretch between them before shifting her attention to the room's grand window. The lace curtains swayed ever so slightly, not from the night breeze but from a movement just beyond them. Someone was there, watching. Before she could press further, a young maid entered, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Her nervous energy was almost palpable. Miss Ravenscroft. She hesitated, glancing toward Sutherland before lowering her voice. I noticed something strange. In the kitchen, there was a powder, something mixed into the sugar jar. I don't think it belonged there. Eleanor's fingers drummed lightly against the sideboard. And where is this sugar jar now? The maid swallowed hard. Gone. The cook said it had been replaced, but I saw it before they took it away, and I know what I saw. Sutherland's voice was a touch too firm. Miss Ravenscroft, surely this is curious. Eleanor cut in, her voice soft but razor-sharp. Very curious. Her gaze returned to the tea set, to the cup that sat just slightly apart from the others, the untouched one, the one meant for a particular guest. A web was forming, a careful pattern of lies and manipulation woven into the fabric of Black Hollow Manor, and Eleanor Ravenscroft, with all her quiet persistence, was about to unravel it thread by thread. The grand halls of Blackthorn Manor were eerily silent, save for the slow, deliberate ticking of the antique clock on the mantelpiece. Inspector Eleanor Graves stood by the parlour's bay window, her fingers lightly trailing the delicate lace curtain. The air smelled faintly of bergamot and something else, something metallic, something wrong. Her eyes flicked to the tea service on the mahogany table, arranged with meticulous care, too meticulous. The faintest shimmer of powder dusted the rim of one of the porcelain cups, barely visible under the chandelier's dim glow. Not enough to notice at a glance, but Graves was not one for glancing, she observed. The door creaked open behind her. James Ashford, the estate's ever-composed butler, stepped inside, his face as unreadable as always. "Inspector," he greeted, the word crisp yet weighed down by something more than formality. "I trust you are making progress." Graves turned, her eyes sharp as a hawk's. "Oh, I'd say so, Mr. Ashford. I've always believed it's the smallest things, the details others overlook, that truly tell the story." She moved toward the tea set, her fingers hovering over the cup in question. "Tell me, has this been preserved?" "Naturally," Ashford replied, though his fingers flexed ever so slightly at his sides, a nervous tick Graves had already catalogued. He disappeared momentarily, then returned with a glass case, setting it before her. Inside rested the cup, pristine, untouched since the night of the tragedy. But Graves saw more than just porcelain. She saw a calculated move, a deception woven with expert precision. She studied the faint residue clinging to the rim. Bitter almond, cyanide, the very poison that had ended Edmund Blackthorn's life in the middle of a parlour conversation, mid-sentence, mid-breath. And yet, this wasn't a crime of impulse, it was one of design. A crime meant to blend seamlessly into the backdrop of an ordinary evening, executed by someone who understood the power of subtlety. Her gaze flicked up to Ashford, whose face remained impassive, but Graves knew better. The tightness in his shoulders, the slight shift in his stance, he was on edge. "Curious," she murmured, more to herself than him. "How well preserved it is, almost as if someone wanted to make sure it wouldn't be lost in the ensuing chaos." "Chaos," Ashford echoed, his voice controlled but too carefully so. Graves leaned back, studying him, the trial, the death, the sudden shift in the family's affairs. One might call it a perfect storm of disorder, or a meticulously orchestrated illusion. Ashford didn't respond, but the weight of unspoken words filled the space between them. Later in the estate's study, Graves thumbed through a collection of correspondence, her instincts pulling her toward a particular envelope. The handwriting was elegant, the words restrained yet laced with something darker. The signature at the bottom confirmed her suspicions: Lillian Forsyth. A woman whose ties to the Blackthorne family were anything but casual. The letter hinted at a relationship far more intimate than the public knew, one that could shake the very foundation of the Blackthorne name, and perhaps one that had already claimed a life. Graves tapped the letter against her palm, the pieces aligning with a precision that made her stomach tighten. This wasn't about a mere inheritance, nor about a lover's quarrel. This was about control, about power wielded with a subtle hand and a poisoned teacup. By the time she left the estate and stepped onto the cobbled streets of Ravenshire, the village was humming with whispers. Shadows moved behind curtained windows, gazes darted away as she passed. The people of Ravenshire had always known more than they admitted, but now, with a murder still fresh in their minds, silence had become a currency of its own. At the local apothecary, Mrs. Hargreaves, the shopkeeper, leaned over the counter with an expression of wary curiosity. "You're looking for something particular, Inspector?" "Just answers," Graves replied, her tone light but her intent razor-sharp. "Tell me, did anyone purchase cyanide recently?" Mrs. Hargreaves hesitated, just for a breath. "Not openly." Graves arched a brow, and less openly. The woman glanced around before lowering her voice. There was an order, unmarked, paid in full, no name given. She hesitated again, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. "But I saw who collected it, Mr. Ashford." Graves exhaled slowly, the final thread tightening into place. The butler, always present but never the center of attention, the quiet architect of a crime designed to remain undetected. But there was still one question lingering in the back of her mind: had Ashford acted alone? By the time she returned to her cottage that night, the village was swallowed in mist, the streets a labyrinth of shifting shadows. Graves poured herself a glass of scotch, her thoughts unspooling. There were still lies to unearth, masks to shatter. The game was far from over, and Eleanor Graves never left a game unfinished. The manor stood silent against the thick evening fog, its towering silhouette a ghostly outline against the dim glow of gas lamps. The chill in the air carried more than just the bite of the approaching night. It carried secrets, the kind that refused to stay buried. Lady Eleanor Westwood tightened her shawl around her shoulders as she stepped carefully across the polished floor, her keen eyes scanning the grand hallway. A whisper of movement made her pause. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but in a house like this, where every creak and shadow told a story, even silence could scream. She had come looking for answers, and perhaps, she thought grimly, she had just found one. On the small side table near the drawing-room entrance sat a single item, a deep red leather-bound diary, its corners slightly burnt, as if someone had tried and failed to erase its existence. She picked it up, feeling the weight of it in her hands, and flipped it open. The words on the first page made her breath catch. "This house is a graveyard, but not just for the dead." The handwriting was unmistakable. It belonged to Lord Benedict Whitmore, the very man found dead in his chambers just a week ago. Poisoned, the kind of poison that left no trace except for the vacant frozen terror in the victim's lifeless eyes. Eleanor's pulse quickened. This was no ordinary discovery. The diary was either a carefully placed clue or a deliberate misdirection. Either way, it changed everything. Her mind raced through the possibilities. James Whitmore, the grieving younger brother who always lingered in the background, or Miss Adelaide, the newly appointed governess who often sat up late at night, scribbling in a notebook of her own. And then there was the possibility no one dared to voice aloud. Was there still someone else lurking within these walls? A soft creak sounded behind her. She froze, the diary shut in her hands with a quiet snap as the heavy oak door shifted slightly. A figure emerged from the dim corridor beyond, their voice low and edged with something unreadable. "Lady Eleanor, what exactly are you doing here at this hour?" She turned slowly, her heart pounding, and when she saw who stood before her, she realized she might have just made her last mistake. The Blackwood Manor loomed in the thick evening mist, its towering spires dissolving into the swirling fog like the edges of a forgotten nightmare. A single gas lamp flickered near the grand entrance, casting wavering shadows along the cobbled path. Miss Eleanor Vale stood just beyond the iron gates, wrapped in the heavy folds of her midnight cloak, waiting. The night carried a quiet hum of unease, a tension thick as the ivy that clung desperately to the estate's weathered walls. She had followed him here, unseen, unheard, the elusive Mr. Thomas Redgrave, the butler who had for years been the silent guardian of Blackwood's deepest secrets. But tonight, he was no mere servant. His movements were too careful, too deliberate, his gloved hands clutching a small bundle wrapped in dark cloth. Eleanor slipped through the gates, her steps merging with the whisper of the wind. The manor's corridors were darker than she remembered, the candle sconces barely illuminating the rich mahogany walls lined with the gazes of long-dead ancestors. Their painted eyes followed her with silent judgment as she crept deeper into the house. She could hear Redgrave's measured footsteps ahead, moving toward the west wing, the part of the house that had remained locked since Lord Blackwood's sudden death. A faint metallic clink echoed through the corridor as he fumbled with a key, slipping into a hidden chamber tucked behind an ornate bookshelf. Eleanor hesitated only a moment before gliding forward, pressing herself against the cold wood of the doorframe. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and something metallic, something unsettlingly familiar. Redgrave knelt before an old wooden chest, his fingers trembling as he pried it open. Eleanor's breath hitched. She saw it then, bundles of letters, a single rusted locket, and a glass vial filled with a murky green liquid. Poison, the very poison that had stolen Lord Blackwood's last breath. But there was something else, a ledger, its pages brittle with age. Redgrave's expression darkened as he skimmed its contents, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had found something that terrified even him. Then came the sound that froze them both. A soft creak, the unmistakable rustle of fabric. Eleanor turned sharply. A shadow moved in the far corner of the room, stepping forward into the dim candlelight. A woman, Lady Blackwood. Her gaze was unreadable, her gloved fingers tightening around something Eleanor could not yet see. But she knew, she had been wrong. Redgrave was not the mastermind, he was the loose thread. And Lady Blackwood, she had come to tie it up. Permanently, the evening mist coiled around the towering spires of Ashbourne Manor, thick and suffocating, as though the house itself exhaled secrets into the night. A single lantern flickered at the gate, its glow barely piercing the swirling darkness. Miss Evelyn Harrow stood motionless just beyond the entrance, her sharp gaze fixed on the solitary figure weaving through the overgrown garden paths, Lady Eleanor Ashbourne. Even in the dim moonlight, Evelyn could see the woman's pale hands trembling as she clutched a small, delicate vial against her chest. Poison, the final act in a carefully orchestrated tragedy, but Evelyn was not here to watch it unfold, she was here to stop it. She moved with practiced silence, her footsteps swallowed by the damp earth. The air was thick with the scent of old roses, their wilting petals sagging under the weight of an unseen storm. Lady Eleanor's pace quickened as she approached the fountain at the heart of the garden, a once elegant structure now cracked and moss-ridden. Evelyn watched as the woman knelt, fingers fumbling as she pried open a loose stone at its base, revealing a hidden compartment. A bundle of aged letters, bound with a scarlet ribbon, lay within. Eleanor hesitated, glancing over her shoulder, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She knew she was being watched. Evelyn stepped forward, allowing the crunch of gravel beneath her heel to break the fragile silence. Eleanor flinched but did not turn. Hiding evidence so soon, Lady Ashbourne? Evelyn's voice was soft, almost kind, but edged with undeniable certainty. The vial slipped from Eleanor's grasp, landing in the damp grass with a muted thud. For a moment she remained frozen, her fingers still curled as if holding something that had already escaped. Then, slowly, she turned, her face a mask of cold resignation. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," she murmured. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, studying the woman's carefully maintained composure. "Don't I?" she said. "The poison was never meant for Lord Ashbourne, was it? No, your true target was someone else. Someone who knew the truth long before you ever planned to silence them." A sharp intake of breath, the only crack in Eleanor's icy exterior. Before either woman could speak again, a new presence made itself known, a figure emerging from the shadows beyond the fountain, Inspector Alden Graves. His dark coat billowed slightly as he stepped closer, his gaze locked on Eleanor. "That will be quite enough," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. Eleanor's shoulders sagged, the weight of inevitability pressing down on her. She looked at the letters still clutched in her trembling hands, then back at Evelyn. "I had no choice," she whispered. "I did what I had to do." Evelyn exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. "No, Lady Ashbourne," she said, voice steady. "You did what you thought you could get away with." As the inspector reached for her arm, Eleanor did not resist. The game was over. The truth, buried for so long beneath layers of deception, had finally clawed its way into the light. The night was far from over, but the mystery at last had come to an end. The candlelight flickered against the damp stone walls of the manor's drawing room, casting restless shadows over the assembled figures. The air was thick with the weight of unfinished confessions, the scent of old paper and lingering perfume mingling into something almost suffocating. At the far end of the room, seated in an ornate chair that once belonged to her late husband, Lady Margaret Hawthorne sat motionless. Her gloved hands were folded neatly in her lap, her face an impenetrable mask of quiet dignity. But even the most carefully composed facades had their cracks, and Inspector Jonathan Graves was trained to see them. He stood near the grand fireplace, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the floor. The embers behind him burned low, their warmth failing to touch the chill in the room. Opposite him, Miss Eleanor Whitmore, the ever-perceptive observer, adjusted her lace gloves with deliberate slowness. She had come to understand long ago that patience was a detective's sharpest weapon. Tonight, however, the time for patience had ended. "The letters were never about blackmail," Eleanor said finally, her voice as soft as it was precise. "They were a warning, weren't they, Lady Hawthorne?" Margaret did not move. "The night Mr. Langford died," Eleanor continued, her eyes never leaving the woman before her, "was no accident. The cup of Darjeeling, laced with arsenic, not meant for him, but for someone else entirely." Still Margaret remained silent. Only the faintest twitch of her fingers betrayed her. The inspector took a step forward, the polished leather of his boots creaking against the wooden floor. "Your husband," he said. He was the intended victim. A sharp intake of breath, not from Margaret, but from the young maid standing near the door. She had been brought here to serve the tea, a mere witness to the proceedings, but now she clutched the edge of her apron, her knuckles whitening. Eleanor's gaze flicked toward her, keen as a knife. "You knew, didn't you, Miss Alcott? You saw something that night, something you weren't meant to see." The girl hesitated, her lips parting, then closing again, fear warred with conscience in her wide brown eyes. "It was the vial," she whispered finally. I found it in the lady's vanity drawer the next morning. Margaret's mask cracked. It was slight, a flicker of the eyes, the briefest tightening of the jaw, but it was enough. Inspector Graves exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. So that's how it was, he murmured. Your husband was never meant to live through that night. But Langford drank from the wrong cup, didn't he? A tremor passed through Margaret's delicate frame, but still she did not speak. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice a whisper now. And that is why you've been silent all this time. Not out of fear, not out of grief, but because you knew that if the truth came out, it would be you standing trial for murder. The room fell into stillness. Outside the wind howled through the trees, rattling the window panes like the fingers of restless ghosts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Margaret Hawthorne lifted her chin. Her lips curled into something resembling a smile, though there was no warmth in it. It seems, Miss Whitmore, she murmured, her voice barely above a breath, that you've been paying attention. The inspector's hand rested lightly on the hilt of his pocket watch, the silent tick of time marking the end of the game. Lady Hawthorne, he said gravely, it's over. And in that moment, with the last vestiges of secrecy stripped away, Margaret let out a breath, slow, measured, final. It was over indeed. The dim glow of the chandelier cast flickering shadows across the mahogany-panelled room, stretching the silence between them like an unspoken accusation. At the long oak table, Lady Eleanor Ashford sat motionless, her hands folded with deliberate poise. But the stillness was deceptive. Beneath the icy composure, her mind raced, calculating the next move. Across from her, Inspector Harrington placed the small glass vial on the polished surface, the soft clink of glass against wood slicing through the thick air like a blade. The poison, he murmured, his tone measured, was not an act of impulse nor a crime of passion. It was planned, methodical, executed with precision. But the question remains, Lady Ashford, why? The woman did not flinch. Her dark eyes met his with an intensity that could have withered lesser men, but Harrington was not one to be easily swayed. He had seen the unraveling of too many carefully crafted facades to be fooled by elegance. Miss Evelyn Harcourt, standing by the window, let her gloved fingers trail along the lace curtains, watching the moonlight dance on the glass. Perhaps, she said softly, it was never about the act itself. Perhaps the true crime lies in what the act was meant to conceal. A shiver passed through the room. Lady Ashford's lips tightened just a fraction, but it was enough. Evelyn saw it, and so did the inspector. Mr. Oliver Langley, Harrington continued, his voice a low rumble, was on the verge of revealing something, wasn't he? He knew more than he was meant to. His gaze drifted to the untouched cup of tea still sitting at the far end of the table, and he paid for that knowledge with his life. A soft chuckle escaped Lady Ashford's lips, low, humorless. You speak as though you already know the answer, Inspector, she murmured. So tell me, what is it you believe I have done? Harrington exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the vial. It isn't about belief, Lady Ashford. It's about what the evidence tells us. The tea, so conveniently prepared. The vial, so carefully hidden, yet found in your vanity drawer, and the letters. He paused, watching her reaction. Ah, yes, the letters, the ones you thought had been destroyed. Evelyn stepped forward, drawing a small folded piece of parchment from her pocket. These were never meant to see the light of day, were they? She mused, unfolding the delicate pages. Correspondence between you and Miss Beatrice Langford, Mr. Langley's sister. The first true flicker of unease passed through Lady Ashford's eyes. You would have risked everything, Evelyn continued, her voice barely above a whisper, to keep them hidden, and you did. At the cost of Oliver Langley's life. For the first time the tension in the room shifted. The power Lady Ashford had wielded so effortlessly for years was slipping through her fingers like sand. She could deny it, of course, protest, feign outrage, cling to the last remnants of her carefully constructed world. But they all knew the truth now, and there was no undoing what had been done. The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, Lady Ashford's shoulders dropped, ever so slightly, not in surrender, not quite, but in acknowledgement. Inspector Harrington straightened. "It's over," he said quietly. And this time, for the first time, she did not argue. The weight of the trial had settled over Ravenshire like a slow-moving fog, clinging to the cobbled streets and ancient rooftops long after the final verdict had been read. The town, once a place of quiet dignity, now bore the invisible scars of its own unraveling. The townsfolk moved with measured steps, their whispers barely louder than the autumn breeze rustling through the willows. But the truth had already seeped into the very foundation of their village, twisting through conversations like a spectre, ensuring that no one would ever forget the name Eleanor Whitmore. She had been the town's pride, a woman of grace and intellect, a philanthropist, a figure who had commanded admiration. But admiration had turned to suspicion, then to horror, as the evidence against her had mounted. The vial of aconite discovered in the secret drawer of her study, the coded letters exchanged between her and the late Jonathan Hale, the damning testimony of a maid who had seen too much but spoken too late. Inspector Harrow had been there when Eleanor Whitmore had finally cracked, her once pristine composure reduced to hollow resignation. He had watched as her shoulders slumped, her breath shallow with the weight of knowing there was no more ground left to stand on. "I never meant for it to spiral like this," she had murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the deeper I went, the less I could turn back." Miss Evelyn Carrington, standing at the periphery of the courtroom, had not looked away. She had heard every syllable, measured every pause, and she had known in that moment that no one, no matter how poised, how calculating, could escape the inevitable hand of truth. Now as Evelyn stepped out onto the damp cobblestones, the town breathed around her, resuming the fragile rhythm of normalcy. Bakers set out fresh loaves, market vendors called to early shoppers, and the church bell tolled, announcing the hour. But beneath the surface, the wound remained. Eleanor Whitmore had thought herself untouchable. She had built a world around her so meticulously that even the slightest tremor should have been beneath her notice. But she had underestimated the reach of her own deception, and in the end, it was not the crime itself that had condemned her, it was the secret she had killed to protect. Evelyn walked past the wrought-iron gate of Whitmore Manor, its grandeur now tinged with an eerie hollowness. She knew the house would soon be abandoned, its windows shuttered, its halls empty, but for the ghosts of all it had held. Justice had been served, but the town had lost something more than a life. It had lost the illusion of safety, the comfort of believing that evil was always an outsider's shadow, and that, perhaps, was the cruelest truth of all. The town of Ashcombe had always prided itself on its stillness, a place where life moved at the pace of the old clock tower in the square, unrushed, predictable and steady. But now, after the trial of Lady Eleanor Whitmore, there was a change in the air. It was subtle, like the aftertaste of bitter tea, but it was there, lingering in the conversations that quieted when certain names were mentioned, in the glances exchanged between villagers who once spoke freely. The truth had emerged from the shadows, unraveling the fabric of polite society, leaving behind the uneasy realization that no one, no matter how poised or powerful, could remain untouchable forever. Evelyn Carrington had seen it all unfold from the very beginning, the whispers of impropriety, the hushed rumors of debts unpaid, the way Eleanor's hand had trembled ever so slightly as she sipped her tea on that fateful afternoon, when Jonathan Hale collapsed, his lips tinged blue from the poison that had sealed his fate. Evelyn had known then, even before the coroner's report confirmed it, that the answer lay not in the crime itself, but in what had driven Eleanor to commit it: desperation, fear, the need to silence a secret so damning that she had risked everything, and in the end, she had lost. Now, as Evelyn stepped into the town's tea room, the familiar scent of bergamot and fresh scones greeted her, mingling with the low murmur of voices discussing the trial's aftermath. Mrs. Whitmore's arrest had left a void, a wound in Ashcombe's delicate social order, and the townsfolk were still grappling with what it all meant. Mrs. Green, the proprietor of the establishment, glanced up from behind the counter, her shrewd eyes softening at the sight of Evelyn. "Ah, Miss Carrington," she said, pouring tea into a porcelain cup with practiced ease. "I imagine you've had quite the week." Evelyn merely offered a small smile, lowering herself into a chair by the window. "Haven't we all?" she mused, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. "It seems the storm has passed, though I doubt the village will ever feel quite the same again." Mrs. Green nodded knowingly, setting a plate of biscuits beside Evelyn's cup. "That's the way of things, isn't it? Truth comes out, and the world rearranges itself around it." Evelyn exhaled slowly, watching as the village carried on beyond the window. A carriage rolled past, its wheels stirring the fallen autumn leaves, and across the square, the imposing facade of Whitmore Manor stood untouched by the scandal within its walls. But Evelyn knew better. The house had changed. It was no longer a symbol of prestige, but a monument to a lie that had been exposed. She took a sip of her tea, letting the warmth settle in her chest. In a place like Ashcombe, secrets had a way of burying themselves beneath layers of civility, hidden in the pleasantries exchanged over afternoon tea, or in the polite nods shared between acquaintances at Sunday service. But even the deepest secrets could not remain buried forever. As Evelyn rose to leave, she caught sight of Thomas Whitmore, Eleanor's husband, standing near the edge of the square. He looked thinner, warier, a man stripped of everything except the weight of his family's name. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, and though no words passed between them, Evelyn could read the silent understanding in his gaze. He was free of suspicion, exonerated in the eyes of the law, but absolution was another matter entirely. She stepped outside, the cool breeze carrying with it the scent of rain, and made her way past the grand estates that had once seemed impenetrable. The truth had cracked their facades, revealing the fragile foundations beneath. And though Ashcombe would rebuild, though life would resume its steady rhythm, one thing was certain: nothing would ever be quite the same again. The village of Ravenshade had always worn its history like an old, well-tailored coat, comfortable, familiar, but fraying at the edges. In the wake of the Ashbourne scandal, the air carried the weight of unsaid things, of secrets dragged into the light, unwilling and raw. The trial had ended, the verdict delivered, but the echoes of it remained, clinging to the cobblestone streets and ivy-covered manors like morning mist. The guilty had been named, the innocent exonerated, and yet a lingering unease settled over the town, as though the very ground beneath them had shifted in ways they could not yet comprehend. Isabel Thorne, ever the observer, watched from her window as the village stirred back to life. The tea-room's sign swayed gently in the breeze, and she knew that inside, familiar voices would already be whispering over steaming cups of Earl Grey, dissecting the fallout of the trial. The townsfolk were creatures of habit, after all. Even scandal, when given enough time, folded itself neatly into the fabric of their lives. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped outside, her boots clicking softly against the damp pavement. As she passed the grand Ashbourne estate, now draped in a silence heavier than its stone walls, she caught sight of Nathaniel Ashbourne standing in the doorway. His figure was thinner, shoulders weighed down by something that no acquittal could undo. The law had set him free, but the village would not forget so easily. His name, once spoken with reverence, now carried an unspoken asterisk: free, but tainted. "Good morning, Mr. Ashbourne," she said, her voice measured. He lifted his gaze, eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Miss Thorne," he acknowledged, his tone devoid of its former arrogance. "I suppose I should thank you in some way." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "Not necessary. Truth has a way of surfacing, whether we like it or not." He let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "That it does, though I wonder, Does it ever truly set one free? She offered a small enigmatic smile. Perhaps not, but it forces us to face what we are, and that, I think, is its own kind of justice. The tea room was alive with hushed voices when she entered, the scent of fresh scones mingling with the remnants of yesterday's scandal. Mrs. Whitmore, the town's most tireless gossip, glanced up from her table, her sharp eyes scanning Isabel for any sign of new intrigue. Mrs. Green, ever the warm hostess, greeted her with a knowing smile. Miss Thorne, I dare say the village owes you a great deal of thanks. Isabel took her seat by the window, fingers curling around the warm porcelain of her cup. The village will forget soon enough, she said lightly. It always does. Outside the fog began to lift, revealing the town in the golden light of a new day. The houses still stood, the people still gossiped, and the world continued its slow, inevitable turn. But Isabel knew better. The surface had been smoothed, but beneath it, new secrets were already taking root, waiting, like all things in Ravenshade, to be uncovered in their time. The village of Blackthorn had always prided itself on its quiet dignity, its well-manicured hedges and polished brass door-knockers, reflecting an order that few dared disturb. But beneath its genteel facade, the village harbored its own ghosts, its own whispered betrayals woven into the very air. The recent trial had rattled its foundations, sending ripples of unease through every parlor and drawing room. Now, as the sun dipped below the spires of St. Bartholomew, a new stillness settled, one that spoke not of relief, but of something left unresolved. Eleanor Wren sipped her tea, the delicate porcelain cup steady in her hand, despite the tension that still coiled beneath her skin. She had spent weeks peeling back the layers of deception, uncovering a truth that the village had long sought to ignore. And yet, even now, she could not shake the feeling that there was something just beyond her grasp, an unspoken detail lurking in the shadows. Across from her, Inspector Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming absently against the table. So, it's over then, he mused, though his voice lacked conviction. Blackthorn can finally breathe again. Eleanor's lips twitched in the faintest of smiles. Over, perhaps. But one never truly knows, Inspector. There's always the next mystery waiting just around the corner. A few familiar faces passed by the window, the ever-watchful Mrs. Aldridge, her sharp eyes darting toward the tea shop, as if sniffing out fresh gossip. Mr. Bellamy, who had barely spoken since the verdict was read, his usual bravado noticeably dimmed. And then there was Frederick Hawthorne, standing by the doorway, his posture stiff with the weight of everything he had endured. Exonerated, yes, but not unscathed. The court had cleared his name, but in a village like Blackthorn, a shadow of doubt was never truly erased. Miss Wren, he greeted, his voice warm but wary. I don't know how to thank you. She studied him, noting the exhaustion that clung to his features. No thanks are necessary, Mr. Hawthorne. The truth has a way of surfacing, whether we seek it or not. He exhaled, running a hand through his dark hair. And yet, it rarely comes without a price. Eleanor inclined her head. No, it does not. The tea shop hummed with conversation, the usual ebb and flow of village life slowly resuming. Talk of weather and garden parties replaced the once urgent whispers of murder and betrayal, but the undercurrent remained. Blackthorn had changed. Its people had glimpsed the darkness beneath their own carefully constructed illusions, and for the first time, they understood just how fragile their world truly was. As the last of the patrons trickled out, Eleanor finished her tea, and rose from her seat, the weight of the evening pressing against her. The sun had set now, casting long shadows across the cobbled streets, and for the first time in weeks, the air felt lighter. Justice had been served, the guilty exposed, but somewhere in the quiet recesses of Blackthorn, another secret was already stirring. She stepped outside, the cool evening breeze brushing against her skin. The village would heal, as it always did. The gossip would fade, the The scandal would soften into memory, and life would resume its quiet rhythm. But Eleanor knew better. There was always another truth waiting to be unearthed, another story lingering just beneath the surface, and when the next whisper of mystery came, she would be ready.